This is the Darcy Giroux Podcast, episode 48. Today, my guest is Fergus Hodgson. We're going to be talking about his new book, The Latin American Red Pill. Fergus Hodgson, welcome to the Darcy Giroux Podcast. How are things?
It's I'm loving beautiful Sunday here in Colorado. I remember going to Capitalism and Morality up in Calgary I don't know, was it 6 months back now? Time flies. So I'm eager to get back to Calgary again.
Yeah, that's right. It was a kind of a pilgrimage to your ancestral homeland.
It's true. Yeah. And although the city has changed so much now, I mean, you still have the Calgary Stampede, which is basically pretty much world famous. And I love going running along the Bow River. Beautiful spot. So there's along the Bow River is actually a chair with my grandfather's name on it when he passed away. I don't know, there was some kind of memorial for him. So I go there each time and just sit and look at the city. It's wonderful.
Oh, nice. Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, well, Capitalism and Morality, the last one you were there, it was a great time. Okay, before we go too much further, give the audience a bit of an introduction to yourself. I know, like, your experience in journalism and economics, and kind of you've had this kind of focus on Latin America also.
Yeah, gosh. It's like going on a date, mate, and women go, "What do you do for a living?" And I'm going, "Oh dear." And it's not easy to define, but basically I left New Zealand to go to college in the United States, and I grew this love for economics. And then I wanted to work in finance, but I graduated around the 2008 financial crisis, and it just wasn't work. But I'd been a successful writer for a student magazine, and I'd published an academic article, so I was offered jobs with think tanks. So I got work with think tanks, and it was kind of like a one-way street almost. And once I got in, I've got momentum. So I've basically been a writer, editor, researcher for classical liberal free market advocacy for the better part of 15 years. And that hasn't changed, just that I'm more independent now. And I focus more on writing books, as we're going to discuss, and practical approaches to your life rather than necessarily advocacy so much, because as I've gotten older, I realize all the different lobbies at play, and I realize how difficult it is to move the dial in any direction. Further, I realize, just like you discussed on one of your previous podcasts, just that whether I like it or not, most people just do not relate to the classical liberal message. It's just not, they don't get it. And so it's very tough to push that to a broader audience. And you can spend your life, shouting away at it, or you can get on with your life and make the best of it as you can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right on. So you put out a book last year, I believe.
Yep.
Financial Sovereignty for Canadians.
Right.
And then your new book, The Latin America Red Pill. So I think, first of all, let's touch on financial sovereignty for Canadians and your presentation at the Capitalism and Morality Calgary seminar, because I think, there was, there's kind of this conversation in Canada and in the US about expatriating, right? And
yes.
And you touch on this in your book, and you end at the seminar you talked about it, and you in a sense advocate that for expatriation, but only if it works for people. And you do have there's a lot of cautions that kind of come with it. Could you tell us your position on that?
Yeah. Okay. And Darcy, I'm really glad to address this, because now, just to note, there is crossover between these two books. Not much, but there is some crossover. So the first one, financial sovereignty, and this one, the Latin America Red Pill. And there's a third, which I hope to have out in maybe 3 or so months, called the Naked MBA, just about business schools. Anyway, and all of them are a little bit autobiographical, and I feel like that gave me some standing to address the topics. But so in terms of expatriation, I'm really pessimistic about expatriation as a strategy. I am an expat. I grew up in New Zealand, and my mother was an expat from Canada. She married a Kiwi, and so had me in New Zealand. And her parents were expats from Ireland to Canada, so I have a lot of experience with this. Plus, I've lived in way too many places, and I think the fundamentally, I mean, it obviously depends where you are. If you're coming from Afghanistan, I mean, okay, it's a different kettle of fish. But if you come from Alberta or New Zealand, where I'm from, or from Colorado, where I live right now, you're just going to have a hard time finding better places to go. That's my bottom line. There are so first there are substantial transaction costs associated with leaving a place, especially a place you grew up in, because you have roots there, you have a community, you know the area, you're a de facto expert. And then so if there are such high costs, the other place better be better be substantially superior to where you are right now. And the problem with that is that most people in the English speaking world don't realize, but we have enjoyed the privilege, you might say, of almost like a cultural classical liberalism, even if it wasn't necessarily written down or conscious. We just had a level of civility and laissez-faire life that isn't the status quo around the world, and that's what I spoke about in Calgary, that it just is the case that the top dozen countries in the world are all either British colonies, former British colonies from northwestern Europe, which is where the UK is, or they're a couple of East Asian places like Japan and Singapore, which in the case of Japan, we bombed them, not we, but the Americans did. And so, so basically, it just seems like this kind of classical liberal, right libertarian approach to life and government is pretty unique to the Northwestern and British colony world. And if you go deep down, go further and say, well, okay, within those countries, let's say we look at those 10 or 12 countries that have a bit more freedom than the rest, where is the most freedom within those? And my basic view is that the freest places are the mountain states, and you could say the mountain prairie province of Alberta. So that's Wyoming, Idaho, Montana, and then Alberta. And then you might say that there's a bit more freedom in a place like Switzerland, which is kind of Anglosphere adjacent, but it's pretty limited. And so if you're already in Alberta, unless you're going to move to Montana, there's nowhere else to go. And even if you were to move to Montana, I mean, we have many of the same problems as you have in Canada. It's unless you're talking about something like gun rights or raw milk, there are these certain policies, it wouldn't be that big of a difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
right on. So again, obviously you have some roots in Canada, but what was it that
Yes.
really, inspired you to write a book on financial sovereignty for Canadians? I mean, you could have picked a lot of other places topics where you have, or even financial sovereignty for Kiwis or Americans, where you're just as your strongs, I would assume, are just as, or your ties are just as strong.
Well, yes and no, because the truth is I left New Zealand when I was 19, and I've never really had a work life there, aside from, I don't know, working at a pizza store or something like that when I was a teenager. And my first job out of college was actually in Canada, out in Halifax. So actually my, let's say, writing expertise is pretty heavily focused on the United States and Canada, and then writing about Latin America for the Canadian and American audiences, right? But the catalyst for the Canadian one was the COVID era and the trucker convoy, because I actually had this Latin America one in mind before the Canadian one. But then I felt like this Canadian topic was just so dire that what is going on? And I thought all these Canadians are wondering what to do. And I should say, actually, so in the Canadian book, I have two chapters about expatriation. One about basically why you shouldn't do it, or why it's a risky idea, and two, if you really are determined where you would want to go. And then I have one chapter in the Latin America book about why the United States is still the freest place to be. And then I've got a chapter about addressing what it's like to go to El Salvador. I touch upon it in different chapters. But so, as you know, mate, I mean, the dystopia that came to Canada, I find it hard to comprehend. It really, we had the same dystopia back in New Zealand because I was stuck in the United States because I don't mind saying this, I didn't get the COVID shots or whatever, or jabs. And that meant I couldn't leave the United States because I couldn't get back in, right? Because the US was not letting anyone except for permanent residents and citizens come and go. And I was a student at the time. I was on a student visa. So I was stuck in the United States and I'm talking with my family about it. And it just changed my view of the world a little bit. I just realized that the people who are, let's say, anti-freedom or don't care about choice when it comes to these matters, their viciousness, their willingness to be vindictive or hurt others just exceeded what I had realized in my life. And even one of my uncles, my godfather, is a professor out in Nova Scotia. And everyone on staff at this university had to get these COVID vaccinations. And he didn't want to, but he got it, right? And he just said that there were staff meetings about it. And ironically, I think it was the chemistry or physics department, the one department that you might would think would be the most sober and intelligent, they were the ones who were against it. But they were a tiny minority, right? And everyone's going, oh, trust the science, you know, this talk. And I think my uncle even raised, well, what about people who just don't want to do it? What if they have to lose their jobs? And basically the staff just said, well, they can lose their jobs then. There was just so little empathy for just freedom of choice. And that just showed me that there's a big problem in Canada. And my heart really goes out to people like you who are, let's say, in the 20% of Canadians who really relate to the trucker convoy or the freedom convoy, whatever you want to call it, who are just people who are not on the payroll or whatever it may be. They're not of the Ottawa class, but they're a little bit stuck because there's this 20% who almost have 0% representation. That's the way I felt, that they didn't have 20% representation. They had zero in the actual parliament of Canada. And so I just said, well, I've been through this before. I've gone around the world looking for freedom. And it's just like you, mate. It's been almost like an obsession in my life, unfortunately, for better and for worse, that when I was younger, I just loved the whole liberty idea. And I went around the world trying to find it. And so I picked up all these lessons along the way. And I wrote a book basically describing, I'm trying to think now, there were kind of three sections from memory. One was just basically what is going on in Canada. And I'm very pessimistic about Canada's future. I hate to say that, mate, that I just fear that Canada is going to be like an Argentina in the future. Now, I wrote this before Malay was just getting elected to run that time,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
Argentina. So I just think Canada's really dug itself into a hole, and that is going to be hard to get out of. Now, so my basic view is that Canada has been one of the most prestigious or prosperous countries on the planet. When my grandparents went there in the 1950s, it really was because Canada was like the land of opportunity, versus living in England, where my grandparents went after Ireland. Canada offered a way better standard of living, right? But I don't know if you could say that anymore, right? So I said, well, if that is the case, and particularly when it comes to this freezing of bank accounts, I'm going, this is totally like whatever like shred of rule of law that Canada had, this just violates all those, let's say, provisos. Even the guy, we all know this, Brian Peckford, the guy who was there at the writing of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms for Canada, said this is all violating what we wrote. I mean, well, he's alive. Like it's not like going back to the founders of the United States and saying, what did they really think? I mean, he's here telling us it's not. It's not consistent. So I just said, this is totally out of control. And I'm trying to use clean language with you, mate. So these psychopaths in Ottawa, they're insane. They are insane. They're totally destructive, and it's like a bad religion where they will just kind of punish the apostates, right? And so I just said we've got to do something about this. Whether we learn, alternative communications platforms, alternative social media. Of course, this is before I think. Well, maybe Musk had just bought Twitter at the time. We need alternative payment platforms. We need to consider different cryptocurrencies. although unfortunately those haven't really flowered as I would have liked to have seen. Some way that we cannot be cancelable. And this is very sensitive to my life because I realize now that when you start talking or when you start really threatening the power structure that in the way that the trucker convoy did, those who are in power they will seek vengeance upon you. And it's a bit like the January 6th thing in the United States. I don't want to get stuck in that, but the organizers of the protests around the trucker convoy, I mean, half of them have been in prison now, and in my view, they're just noble Canadians that did nothing wrong.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I really agree with you that. I mean, it was COVID and the COVID in general, and the trucker convoy was cool to watch. But it was those situations that had me start this podcast, because at the time I was like, man, there's like so little, like from our kind of worldview where how this is being discussed. I mean, even from the conservatives federally and provincially were terrible on COVID, right? And even though a lot of the trucker convoy, freedom convoy people are putting a lot of faith in those parties to make the difference. I mean, for me, it was you needed that more libertarian, anarcho-capitalist kind of position to balance out some of the things that were being said, right? Anyway, yeah, that's definitely what inspired me to get active here. So let's move into Latin America. So now, correct me if I'm wrong. I think I remember you telling me that originally you went to Latin America kind of under the romantic illusion that you would find, potentially a free place or a bastion of maybe not liberalism, but where government was not going to give a person too hard of a time for what they did, or the possibility of, I know there are a lot of people that go down there with this idea of setting up kind of these alternative communities and structures to kind of distance themselves from big state apparatuses. But is that kind of what sent you down there originally?
Yeah, gosh, mate. Yes and no. I mean, there's a lot to say about it. And your questions were open-ended, so I took them in different directions, but I didn't actually address Latin America. So,
Yeah.
but I gotta be honest with you, I didn't know a heck of a lot about the region before I had a relatively blank slate. And I said in the book that I didn't really have even very many stereotypes. Yeah, it is true that I met some Latinos in college, and they perked my curiosity. So I went to Boston University and had a friend from Colombia. And I've been an athlete, a serious athlete for about 10 years, from about 15 to 25. So I'd basically been chained to the river, right? Because I was training twice a day on the water for about 10 years. And I wanted to break out a bit. And it's true. I felt like, and this is not, I'm not making this up, that the path in the Western countries, like you said, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, are the ones that I'm familiar with, and to some degree the US, but less so the US. But the path to just buying a house, to starting a business, to kind of launching in life is getting more and more difficult. People have got student loans, they've got to do this so long in university, and I just felt like, and there's all this taxation. I just thought it's a really tough way to go. Is there any way I can opt out of this and find a better alternative? And at the same time, too, I don't deny it. People can say what they want about me, but I really could not stand feminism. And we've had a couple of female prime ministers of New Zealand, and they've been a train wreck. Not all of them. There was one back in the 90s who was fine, Jenny Shipley. But I just felt like that particular issue drove me to look for more of a kind of like a positive, a culture that would be more positive towards men. And I felt like Latin America might be that, right? So, because I just felt like I was the enemy of many people, and I didn't really know what I'd done, to be frank. And so, because I was kind of like the evil capitalist, and I found it unbearable. And then back in 2007, so when I was still back in New Zealand, before I went to Canada looking for work, there was this major pension scheme, kind of like a Canada pension plan or a social security scheme, just introduced to New Zealand. And it got me so angry. I wrote an article about it and I called it the deceit of KiwiSaver. And it also made me very angry that they had taken the word Kiwi, which is our term for New Zealand, and put it on some kind of government program. I go, this is not Kiwi, stop, trashing our, legacy. Anyway, so I was just very frustrated. And so, yeah, I just bought a one-way ticket to Colombia. I didn't know what I was going to find. I had looked at the rankings of economic freedom. So I knew that Chile at the time was the freest. And my plan was to basically settle in Chile, learn Spanish, and see if I could make a home there, find work. I didn't really know what I'd find. But what I found, though, was that I just couldn't because the pay was so terrible. And I just ended up going back to the United States and getting a job there. Yeah.
Right, right, right.
And also, at the time, I still had very superficial understanding. I just knew that there wasn't money there. So I needed to make some money. So I'm going, this is not working. And later I learned a heck of a lot more because what happened is that after that first trip, I realized that there was a great deal of demand for people in the Anglosphere who actually know about Latin America because almost nobody does. And so I ended up getting work just kind of in that domain without planning it, that when I got my first journalistic job, there happened to be a big Honduran community in Louisiana where I was working as a journalist. And so I would write articles about their events. And then the fact that I spoke Spanish got me my next job in North Carolina. And so then someone invited me to be the editor of a publication about Latin America. So it just kind of snowballed or whatever until it became my life. And I kept looking, but I just found a lot more. And the whole story is in this book, of course. And I've tried to distill. I mean, I couldn't put everything in the book. There's so much I could say, but I tried to distill the most important elements of that journey for anyone who would like to know. And the kind of the odd part is that there are still people I see on social media doing exactly what I did 15 years ago. It's crazy. Anyway.
Yeah, for sure. So,
yeah.
So how much time, how much time have you spent in Latin America? Like you've been down there quite a bit, but you've never really set up
I
shop
did
there.
actually. I did set up shop there.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
So I spent. So I've been to 19 of 20 countries. I haven't been to Bolivia. I mean, I should have just paid the $1,000 or whatever when I had the chance, and it would have been easier when I was down in Argentina. And I lived in Miami for a lot of that time, which is basically a part of Latin America. But I went to Argentina for a year, and then I went to Guatemala for about 2 years. So I also my first trip was 4 months long, and I had extended stays in Ecuador and Paraguay. And I mean, I've been to too many places, to be frank. I've been to even the kind of adjacent countries. I've been to Belize, Aruba, Puerto Rico, whatever. But beyond that, I really made it an intellectual quest. So not only did I visit all these places and live in a couple of countries, I just took in that's why the book has all this like additional resources section, because all these books, all these movies, all these lecture series, I recommend them to other people, which ones I think are most insightful. And I felt like I had found a history or a perspective that just wasn't getting enough coverage. And my personal view is that if you go by legacy media or the formal university world, you will be totally clueless about Latin America. I wish that's too strong. You will be missing part of the story. Yeah, yeah. So there are these competing views of Latin American history, and if you go to university, you just get one side of that story. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So how has your perspective changed and evolved? Like what were your you said you didn't have much of an idea of what you're getting into at first, but compared to now, or like what were some of the transitional things throughout your perspective in Latin America?
Well, I think I started out with more. So when I began learning about Latin America's problems, which made it, so the first lesson, I guess, was just that the problems here are much more severe than I had realized, right? So and I note this, that's one of the first chapters of the book. I note these real deep problems in the area that we might joke about or mention, but we don't quite understand how profound they are. So I mentioned crime, poverty, class division, low trust, and anti-capitalism. And at the time, I didn't realize how severe they were, but now I realize that the difference between a place like where you live on the outskirts of Calgary or in let's say small town Alberta is huge. That if you were to go and get a regular salary in a place like let's say Ecuador is kind of like a middle country, literally means on the equator, you'd take an 80% pay cut, and you would face crime probably about, I say at least 5 times higher, probably 10 times higher. You would just you'd also deal with a place where basically, I hate to say it, but cheating is just kind of a way of life, and it's very strange, and I find it really I found it really tough because I've dealt with these problems firsthand. And I remember when I was an editor, when I was editor in chief of a publication on Latin America, and I had this view, this very, let's say, New Zealandish or Kiwi view that give everyone a chance, give everyone let them give them a crack. But basically, before I knew it, I had people who were plagiarizing and lying to me. I was going, what? And so one of my good workers in the team who now lives in France, she said, Ferg, this kind of trusting approach is not going to work with this project. You've got to set up some kind of barrier to entry. And I learned really the hard way. I've got a note. So, like I said, I said the first was just learning the gravity of the problems, which I don't think Canadians or Americans can even comprehend unless they live it themselves. Then I learned that gradually I came to the conclusion that it wasn't some kind of top-down conspiracy. Because people will blame Spanish colonialism, American imperialism, some kind of European plunder or exploitation. And I actually have the exact opposite view now that in fact, if you go to most of these countries, the most beautiful buildings are from the Spanish colonial era. And the most productive companies are the foreign companies that come in and give people stable jobs and good compensation and treat them well. And so the sort of anti-outsider mentality is counterproductive, unhealthy, and it's a scapegoat. And there was one of the books that motivated. There were two, let's say, historic books that I address in this book and that motivated me, and they're both written in the 1970s. One is called The Open Veins of Latin America, and that one basically is the sort of leftist populist book about how all our failures are someone else's fault. And the other book called The Latin Americans is basically saying, no, we have to look ourselves in the mirror. But that was 50 odd years ago. So I'm kind of taking a lot of that. I'm trying to add to that debate. And in general, like I said, I now am very sympathetic to the Spanish colonizers. I think that they helped to lift a lot of the, let's say, even very vicious or unsavory things that were going on in Latin America. Yeah, I'm not saying they were perfect and they did many wrong things or missteps, but it's not like Latin America would be some kind of fountain of joy if they'd never gone there.
Right, right, absolutely. So I think you've touched on this, but I would like you to just kind of narrow down and I know this is kind of a collection of essays and articles, but kind of the core thesis of how you put this together.
Yeah, so I don't know if you were there, but I think it was 2018 or 2019. I went to the Capitalism and Morality event in Vancouver. And because Jayant had seen me writing about Latin America, and he said, "Ferg, come and speak." And I said, "Great, I'd love to." Right? Just also just to have, just like coming to the one in Calgary, just to have good friends or form community. And people had asked me, "Are you going to put your, let's say, reflections into a book?" And I thought, well, yeah. And I basically, this book had been on my mind for about 5 years or a long time. And what I'd done is I took let's say the most meaningful and timeless articles from my era, And I was going to just publish them as is, but then basically I decided to write about maybe a dozen more chapters just for the book. And so really, it's very kind of heavy on recent perspectives, kind of the accumulation of what I've written. And I was unsure how to organize it. And to be frank, I had so many other chapters that I wanted to include, but it was just getting too long. So I thought, well, maybe I should do it in terms of problems or observations. I said observations, explanations, and conclusions to give it a little bit more meaning or understand, a little bit, make it a bit more comprehensible to the reader. And so the first section, I describe the real challenges and why I think they don't get talked about. And like I said, I outlined the five, and I discussed the way that there's basically a socialist or statist bias in media and academia, and they don't want to talk about the real problems. And there are also these progressive dogmas that make it even worse now, such, whether it's all cultures are equal or the same or whatever it may be, that get in the way of just an open dialogue about the issues. And then I discuss why do we have these problems, and then what are we going to do about it? And so I hope people draw some kind of conclusion, that they can, it makes sense to them. If not, I mean, they can give me a call or write to me or something, because I like to think that I've come to some clear conclusions, and to me, the evidence in favor of my conclusions is so overwhelming that it's almost, I don't know what you would say to kind of debate with me. And I should say too that there are very few, if any, native English speakers who have more experience across Latin America than I have. I mean, I really threw 15 years of my life at this, and so I mean, of course, there are historians of Latin America, whatever, who, especially Spanish speakers, who might know more of the details than I do. But in terms of speaking to this English language audience, I just feel like I'm in a very unique position to share that story or that journey.
Yeah. Okay. Let's get into the meat of some of this book. One of the ones you and I kind of discussed before, one of the chapters, was the 6 reasons why Venezuela has real socialism. I really like this for a lot of reasons. One, because I've followed the Venezuelan story, and I mean, it's heart-wrenching. You see what's gone on there. And secondly, because I think the reasons you're pointing out, they have relevance in every situation where people are battling against this crazy socialist nonsense, including in places like Canada, where all these problems still exist, or at least the threat of them, but it's only a matter of to what degree, right?
Yeah, I mean, and in that chapter, which because I had to read through all these chapters again before so I've read this too many times, but I kind of enjoyed this chapter. I just thought it was funny, and I look back, gosh, did I write this? You read back because you forget the details at the time, and you go, this article wrote itself because they did so many insane plans. I'm going, how did they do this? They really just wrote like a sitcom of their socialist experiment. But the point was just that a lot of people get tripped up by this word socialism, and a lot of, let's say, lefty or progressive Canadians and Americans think they're socialists. And up in Canada, they're much more open about it. So I'm guessing the NDP types and Rachel Notleys of the world would just say, I'm a socialist. They wouldn't hide it. In the US, I know Bernie Sanders would say it, and maybe Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, but in general, politicians avoid that word. But all I really meant, and I describe it here, is centralization of the means of production. Right? That's what socialism is, and I get this from some kind of major the socialist worker. Okay, here we go. The social worker says a society based on workers collectively owning and controlling the wealth their labor creates. Right, in the Marxist tradition, and then I went through and described how the Chavistas in Venezuela, they did everything. They confiscated and nationalized industries. They imposed price controls. They had all these ridiculous collective property projects where everyone was just going to live in harmony. They demonized capitalists and employers and basically stole from them. They formed little alliances with other socialist regimes. And then, of course, because they screwed everything up, they started to ration things. They said, well, because from each according to his means to each according to his needs, we will just ration. You deserve this many eggs or this many tomatoes or this much toilet paper, or whatever it may be. And so when people tell me that Venezuela doesn't have real socialism, I don't know what to say to them. I just go, what, please give me a better example of socialism, and maybe because this is the textbook. It fits the design exactly, and but they don't want to face up to it because they always socialists in North America would always say, well, we want to have Norway. I'm going, well, they have a highly productive class, or let's say capitalist sector that pays for this outlandish welfare state. So really what they are is welfare statists. That's what they really are. They're not socialists.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. What is the current state in Venezuela? Because compared to 5 years ago, you're not hearing the same amount of horror stories and riots and that sort of thing. So what's happening there right now?
Well, there's been, you could say, Venezuela fatigue, and not a lot has changed really. So Hugo Chavez died in, I think, 2013. So it's been more than a decade under his successor, who he chose, Nicolas Maduro. Soon after Chavez died, there was a lot of optimism that maybe there could be some kind of turnaround or removal of the regime. And that's so 2014, when I went there, was the big kind of explosion of interest in Venezuela, both outside the country, because at that time, a lot of the exiles were still fresh and still hopeful that they could go back, right? So there were these huge protests all around the world in this hashtag SOS Venezuela, and just everyone was excited that maybe we could make a change. And the protests were enormous. I mean, at the time, I don't know if you were on Twitter or X at the time, but there were these videos of just these glorious protests across Caracas and the whole country. And because all the opposition, they wear white, and all the Chavistas wear red for communism. And so they'd all be covered in white just across all the streets. But and this was a little bit of a wake-up call to me. What I realized is that the people in power really did not care about the protests. And they were quite happy too. If people started to make real problems like breaking things or I don't know, getting in the way of police, they'll just shoot the people doing that. So they would murder. I'm not sure the exact numbers right now because it's been many years, but they would just kill the people who were the most combative. And they were also quite willing to persecute opponents. So Leopoldo Lopez was a key opposition politician, and he was put in prison under ridiculous charges. Maria Corina Machado has been a long-time opposition politician, and she has been banned from running. And then lots of the prominent journalists have had to flee for their safety and now live in Panama or Florida, or even lots of Venezuelans live in Canada now. So what's happened, unfortunately, is that people have kind of become accustomed to this new status quo of having a narco dictatorship, and that's just the way they live now. They've just accepted it, that they're just starting their new lives in Florida or Canada, and they've become accustomed to that new life. And there was some after because all these fraudulent elections go on, there was like an attempt at kind of like a parallel government. Juan Guaido was the guy's name, who was I think he was president of the National Assembly or something like that, and the U.S. I think under Trump maybe noted him as the actual real president, but unless you're going to actually invade and make him president, it doesn't really stand for much. They also built a parallel criminal or court system based in Panama. But again, what are you going to do? Unless you've got this is the kind of the painful truth about government. Unless you have the military and police, it all doesn't really come to much.
Let me think about this. So the situation in Venezuela was terrible. Sounds like it hasn't got much better. There's another interesting article, a short one, a response you wrote to Jacob Hornberger. But I think that one I find like Hornberger's been, he's done a few things that I think he's fair game for criticism, but a good guy overall. And I think it kind of highlights something larger in libertarian criticism of some things also, because we have a tendency, especially I think in the United States, to everything is the fault of the United States government. Everything everywhere in the world is the fault of the
Yes,
United States
basically.
government. So could you
Yeah.
comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, gosh, Darcy, it's great to chat about that one because I got to say that I actually respect Jacob Hornberger, and I used to write for his organization, and I think he's a gentleman. And so, but obviously he is a bit like you and me, where he shoots from the hip. He'll just say what he, and so that can get you into trouble sometimes. Now, it was just a case that at the time, I think what had happened that the president of Venezuela, so Nicolas Maduro, had published an article in the New York Times. And it was a call for peace. And this was the most Orwellian article possible. I just could not believe that the New York Times fell for this crap. And I think the next day, there was a lot of chatter about it. And I think the next day was when Jacob Hornberger wrote an article basically defending the Maduro regime and saying we should not get involved in that he believed that CIA was behind these protests, right? Or not necessarily, I don't know if he mentioned the CIA directly, but just US officials were behind or fomenting these protests. And I just found that really sad, to be frank, because I knew that there was a dictatorship that was out of control and brutal and causing all sorts of problems, and that the people were just legitimately protesting against that. It's a bit like it's a bit like feminists coming to the aid of Muslim regimes, right? You know, it's very confusing, and you're going, why is this? Like, because they just hate, let's say, the U.S. government so much that they think, well, these Muslim regimes must be better because we hate the patriarchy or something. I'm going, they have a much worse patriarchy than we have. Don't you know this? But so the but the problem is that I included that chapter, even though it was only a small little blog post I wrote quickly at the time, because it's a perennial problem, like you say, that in the United States we just think, and Canadians kind of have this too, almost like I said, kind of like an adjacent problem, that we think we're to blame for all the problems around the world. And it is true that since World War II ended, the US has largely been, well, up until about 10 years ago, has largely been the defender of the world order, you might say, or international trade or norms. But I do fear when it comes to things like, especially Russia's expansion, libertarians have really fallen off a cliff there. They have really made a mistake in basically backing the Russian regime or something like that and blaming the US for this problem. And so even people at the Mises Institute, whom I respect, would fall into this trap. And and it's weird too because years ago, Russia Today, RT, used to interview me often for their channel, right? And you wonder, why is that? Why do they get all these libertarians on RT, which is a state propaganda outlet for the Russian regime? Because they want to get on people who will trash the US government.
Right. Yes. Yeah,
And
absolutely.
one of my Russian friends, who's in exile now in Ireland, she told me about this. She said, these libertarians are basically duped. They don't realize they're just pawns of this Russian regime. And so also, I went to, a few years ago, I took a trip to Georgia out in the Caucasus, right? And Georgia is one of these countries that's been under the shadow, like Ukraine or Moldova, under the shadow of Russia for forever. And the Georgians are very tough people. I mean, it's kind of like a warrior, small warrior nation because they've had to be because of all their dangerous, and neighbors. And when I was there, this is maybe 5 years ago, they had their Independence Day celebration. And so a big kind of parade through the town in Tbilisi, and they had the US military marching in the parade. And that really had an impact on me that the people there, they wanted to be in the Western or world. And they had much of a, like the negative view we have of the US military here in the United States, in which I have to say I'm, guilty of a lot of the time, they did not have. Because they realized that the Americans were there helping them to defend the country against the Russians. Because I don't know if people know, but Russia still occupies two parts of Georgia. And since about 2008, there was a war with Georgia, and Russia had come to some kind of truce, but just never left. And so they're stuck there, kind of like Crimea. And I just realized that there is a propaganda war on. And when you don't know a lot about the other country or the foreign country, you're much more susceptible to their propaganda. And I also realized too that RT in English, they will attack the US government and have libertarians on, but in Spanish, they'll promote Cuba and Venezuela. They just kind of, it's very, very confusing. It's just an outlet that will just kind of serve the wishes of the Russian regime. And like I said, I find it tough. Look, I'm a naturally, just like you, a non-interventionist, but I do not like the Russian military basically invading other countries and then unfortunately seeing right libertarians or libertarians in general defending that or saying that these other countries had it coming. Because I've been to Georgia, I know Moldovans, Ukrainians, and they are not excited about these invasions. It's a bit like, and people will say to me things like, oh, but Ukraine, it used to be part of Russia, or they're just Russians anyway. And go, well, does that mean we can just go and invade Canada? And, because they're Anglo-Saxons and they're still under the thumb of the British and we're going to liberate them from the British? I mean, this logic doesn't make a lot of sense. So that's where I do fear when it comes to foreign policy, libertarians can fall into the trap of thinking the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and he is not your friend. That's the problem. And also I don't know how long you want me to talk about this topic, but there's so much to say about it because one of the times that I really got a bit of a wake-up call about foreign intervention or foreign meddling was in Nicaragua, where one of the very few countries in Latin America that kind of had a pro-America president was precisely the one that got kicked out of office.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we save that story for another time because there are a few things I do want to get into.
Yeah.
And I'll actually, so there's two topics I want to make sure we touch on here. One is borders,
yes.
Specifically kind of the libertarian position on borders, which is, varying kind of on one end of the spectrum or the other, and not a lot in the middle. But the other one is, kind of parallels that you might see between challenges in Latin America and other countries. So I guess pick which one you want to do first, because I kind of think on the issue of borders that they kind of connect a little bit, right?
Yeah. So, and you discussed this too in one of your previous episodes, just how let's say you do have this classical liberal view, which I know you were saying that no one really identifies as that anymore. I still do to some degree. And there is the Institute for Liberal Studies in Canada that does identify and tries to promote the idea of
a great place. Matt Buffton and them, they do great work.
Exactly, yeah. So I've known Buffton for a long time, and I remember years ago chatting with him at a conference, and he explained to me, we're trying to reinvigorate the traditional view of liberalism, or the word liberal. I'm going, good luck with that, buddy. But now that I am a bit frustrated that people have basically stolen the word liberal in the United States and Canada, and even when I was growing up, the word liberal was used in a classical sense in New Zealand. But anyway, so in terms of borders, it's a bit like abortion, where it's kind of like this right-left dichotomy, where the left libertarians are super open borders and the right libertarians are super closed borders, and it's a confusing breakdown there. Yeah, but I was always a right libertarian, you might say, who was pro-open borders, especially because I had dealt with immigration processes myself, and I thought these guys are not the smartest chaps around, right? And because I've got so many stories from going to the U.S. border, and I make my own problems basically by saying things that get them confused, and then they want to play games with me. Once I said that I didn't have to give them my fingerprints because I said I'm a Canadian citizen, and that was enough to just like the siren was going off, So,
oh my God!
And so that was one moment actually where I actually had sympathy for people who don't like the police, because I had all these border goons with their hands on me, and I just wanted to fight and get them off me. I just get off me. Like, it just so much in my personal space. I really hated it. It was just a very uncomfortable feeling, kind of like being claustrophobic. And now I knew I couldn't do that because then I'd end up in jail. But I had a very strong feeling of wanting to resist them. So, but the big problem the big thing is that it is true that enforcing immigration laws is very expensive, and impeding people's freedom of movement has huge opportunity costs, right? So it is true. This is where Brian Kaplan and the George Mason types who promote open borders, they're not idiots. I do not want to get into that kind of dismissive tone that a lot of libertarians or people who are right wing or whatever think that open borders advocates are just idiots, and they are not. They're not idiots. They're very thoughtful. But I do think they overlook some elements or downplay some problems with open borders. And part of the reason I think, and I hate to make this as a little bit of an ad hominem fallacy, is I don't think they really have a lot of experience in the third world. I don't think they know what they're dealing with. That they're living in these very pristine kind of academic worlds where it's all just an intellectual exercise. Now, because I just realized that, yes, the libertarian or classical liberal or even just mildly laissez-faire view is an extreme minority in the world. If you were to take the idea of gun rights, for example, which is kind of like the underlying foundation of America, we will use guns to defend ourselves, even to kick out the king or whatever. That is such a tiny minority of the world that if you were to open the borders to the United States and just let anyone in, that view would be flooded by the next election, basically. It would be gone. So I just realized that if you care about particular elements of Western society or the first world, that it's kind of impossible to let in outsiders. And this is one of the most important chapters in the book, Why I Gave Up on Open Borders. And I'm going to actually publish it. I'm trying to get it published just as kind of like a preview to the book in another outlet, because I went through, because I was such a die-hard open borders and die-hard anti any kind of like ethnic or racial profiling or anything like that we're just all blank slates. And I had to go through a lot of almost rewiring of myself to accept that that's just not the way the world works. And so in terms of open borders, my personal view is that, yes, we have distinct values, habits of the first world or the Western world that are not shared by the rest of the world. So if you let anyone come in, you're just begging to destroy those values or to be flooded. Second, one of the chief, let's say, behaviors that made us successful over a very long period of time, very incrementally, but over centuries, was our relatively high trust societies. And it just is the case that, first, most of the world doesn't have high trust. That's just not even a thing. But second, if you bring them in, they'll just use that high trust to their advantage, that you'll trust them, but they won't trust you. It won't be reciprocated. And this is what Jayant Bhandari talks about all the time, actually. And this is a bitter pill for me to swallow because I don't like having to keep people out or impede their freedom of movement. But I just think like I say, it's a suicide mission. If let's say you're Switzerland and you have this very refined society, decentralized, I mean, if you just let everybody in, forget it. Right? You just get out of here. It's not going to exist. There are only something like 6 million people in Switzerland, as far as I remember. But almost everybody wants to live there because it's this beautiful mountain oasis almost. And it would just be flooded in no time. And those things would be a thing of the past if everybody could just go in there. And there was this funny experience too, that even for Latin Americans, even if because they want to, let's say, moved, not all of them, but many of them want to move to the North America or Anglo America. But even they have a problem because when I was in Ecuador, I remember under Rafael Correa, he basically opened the borders to some degree to African nations. And basically, anyone could go to Ecuador with basically no visa from wherever you wanted to come from. And I'm not making this up. Nigerians would come and they would not assimilate. And you'd go to a restaurant and the Nigerians would just come into the restaurant and just sit there all day and not order anything. They just didn't understand that this is private property. You don't come here. And it was just weird. I was going, oh, so my open borders, how do I deal with this problem? That there are these kind of shared spaces and shared values about how you use these public spaces, and many people just don't have them. And I remember looking at the waitresses or the owners of these restaurants thinking, what are they going to do about this? Are they going to call the cops on these guys? Or just, it was really weird. They just treated it like a public house to just go and hang out, right? And I thought, gosh, even here, there's this problem of the commons. And so also, I mean, this is where some of it gets into, a lot of just firsthand observations, right? So I remember, I mean, I've got so many observations now of people basically stealing. And in a high trust society, like let's say small town Alberta, if you go to an ice cream store, they might just let you just help yourself to try a little bit of the ice cream. You go to the soft serve or whatever, and you just try it. But you would never do that in Latin America because people would just come in and just start pouring it out and just take the whole bunch, right? They would just never do that. And these little niceties or like pleasantries of the West will be lost if you have a more diverse society. Further, I just realized that even though you and I, we don't like, it's not really in our nature to be strongly ethnocentric. It's just not something we do, right? And and but I realized that other groups they really are, right? So they really work with their own kind of ethnic group, and that almost is to our disadvantage. So I note in the book how there's literally a group that up until recently was called La Raza. They changed their name because they thought it would sound bad to Americans, but it was called La Raza, which refers to the mestizo race of people. And now they call it Unidos US, whatever. They literally raise money to fund mestizo or Hispanic candidates. They're really mestizo candidates. And they'll even have all these housing programs and special programs just for their community. And they've got, I think, like something like $70 million a year for this. And I'm going, imagine if I had a nonprofit that just raised money and said, I'm going to give funding to just white only or just Anglo-Saxon candidates and no one else. People would, want to shoot me, right? But they do it out in the open and then no one even thinks about it. And so I just realized that even though I grew up with basically an ethnic blindness, that other groups don't have this, and it causes all sorts of problems. I go through one of the stories. It was from when I was in New Orleans. In a place like Louisiana, you still have a segregated university system. Not by law, anyone can go to whichever university he wants to, but people still go to the ones of their own ethnic group. And the governor at the time, Bobby Jindal, he proposed to partially amalgamate a black and a white university in New Orleans because there are two there, and both of them are, I hate to say it, but struggling to put it gently. And I just saw how the blacks didn't want it. They didn't want to be with the white university. I'm going, so you want segregation? I don't get it, but they did. And I just realized this tension really impedes just open dialogue and healthy relations. And I realized that, places like Canada or Australia or New Zealand where I grew up, we enjoyed a relatively high trust and more peaceful society. And, that's going to be a thing of the past, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. Crazy. Um, Yeah, boy, there's a ton of stuff I would we're going to have to do this again because we've eaten up almost an hour and I got a lot more stuff I need to talk to you about. On the subject of borders though, I mean, I guess I would like to again, I struggle with this too because on one hand, I don't want to impede anybody's freedom of movement and that sort of thing. On the other hand, it's impossible to look at, the United States southern border and pretend there's not a huge problem there. Like it's impossible to watch what's happening there and be like, man, this is fine. You cannot say that. Now, I guess, and again, coming from the libertarian perspective, I'm always looking to, pin these problems on the government. I know in Canada, for example, there was one instance where, just recently, even the Liberals are starting to talk about curbing immigration a little bit. And all they had to do was, I mean, and I forget which African country it was, all they did was stop advertising to come to Canada. And it stopped almost immediately. Right? So it's like is you know what I mean? And I'm curious how many policies like that or how many programs like that exist where it might be that simple to, to have a more, and again, all I really have ever advocated for is a market-based immigration policy where maybe the government is less involved and it's more up to individuals who are, if I need to hire somebody from somewhere else, so be it. Or if I'm going to bring my grandmother here and take care of her, so be it. But when it's tied into kind of, the great big nation state making these decisions about who's coming, I don't know. and I don't know how much my bias towards anti-state stuff plays into this, but I have a pretty strong feeling that if the government kind of got out of it a little more, these problems would solve themselves pretty fast.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is the problem that let's say you're starting with the position that you are an anarcho-capitalist and you believe in express consent, right? That we should not violate people's consent. But we also believe in property rights as a natural right. Okay. That would only really get you to small communities, a bit like a Liechtenstein or Monaco or San Marino or something like that. That's really the anarcho-capitalist dream. These very small communities that pretty much have consent. I mean, it's almost like consent, because in the case of Liechtenstein, any town or village or whatever is allowed to just secede. They just, it's just, and it's in the constitution. There's a right to secede. You can leave anytime you want. So that's the problem, that if you were dealing with immigration on that level, it could be done on a private basis, and it almost wouldn't be a problem, because you would just say there's no wealth, you'd have no welfare state. You just kind of, it could be dealt with like a gym membership or something like that. It would just be very simple. We're just going to kick you out if we don't like you. It would be a totally different ballgame. But we're stuck with a country like Canada, 40 odd million people, and how do you deal with this? And I tend to agree with you that what has happened is that people in office, especially the leftists, know that immigrants are basically a future voting bloc for them. Now, not 100%, of course, but to a large degree, especially in the United States and in places like New Zealand too, that they're not inviting guys like me to come. Even though you would think, well, why not, Fergus? You would cost nothing. You're not on the welfare. You'd seem like a simple choice. But I personally believe that the ruling classes of places like Canada, the United States, New Zealand, Australia, what have you, realize that importing a more subservient, dependent population entrenches that ruling class. It's a bit like, and this is kind of a scary thing that I read recently, that actually the Democratic Party doesn't want women to get married. Basically, it's kind of like has policies almost to keep them unmarried, because then that unmarried women support them more. And it's kind of scary that they would be so kind of stealthy about it. And I remember back in New Zealand, I'm jumping around a bit here, but back in New Zealand, there was a push for government subsidized or free childcare. And one of the gentlemen at my university whose wife had been a candidate for that party, for the Labour Party, or like the Liberal Party, but of New Zealand, he said that basically they were building a constituency of support. They were like getting permanent women who now would vote. They're kind of like giving them the carrot of the free daycare, and they just knew they'd be permanent voters. And my personal view is that the real problem is the welfare state. That so long as you have a welfare state, and not just unemployment benefits, but education, healthcare, housing, all sorts of things, you're going to have a real problem keeping people out. And because the people have been asking me about how Trump got supposedly a majority of Hispanics, whatever, in the US, and to me, part of it is just that Hispanics in the US context, they don't really care about immigration enforcement. It's not like, but they do care about the welfare state. So Trump did not seek to cut any of that, right? And they're going so long as that is there, I mean, because immigration enforcement is almost irrelevant at this point, because you've got, let's say, 25 million illegals. Almost no one's getting deported. It hardly makes a dent. And so, but if you were to actually say, from now on, there'll be no government healthcare, no government education, no government anything for anybody who comes here for, let's say, 20 years, or even, never, that would change the game immensely. And because in Canada, I know that a lot of the new arrivals, they get special kind of refugee welfare. I'm going, is this insane? What kind of genius plan is this? Everyone's going to be a refugee if you're just giving up free money for it.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Okay, Fergus, how can people connect with you and support your work?
Okay, mate. I mean, best place is X, just at Ferg Hodgson. Of course, the Latin America Red Pill is on Amazon or Amazon.ca for Canadians, and also Financial Sovereignty for Canadians. The book actually only came out earlier this year, so it's pretty fresh, really. And I'm glad to talk more about it, or to extend on these issues, because just like you, mate, I care about these topics. It's not just, I don't just write these for money. It's really, from the heart. Yeah.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. Boy, if I was doing this for money, I wouldn't be doing it at all, I tell you.
Also, I mean, next time I would love to talk about secession in Canada. That's the one thing I really care about.
Yeah.
Because you're in Alberta. I love the idea of an independent Alberta. I would move up there. I'm all for it. And anyway,
we had our little panel on secession at the conference was fantastic.
Yeah, well, because I just like I said, I'm not optimistic about any kind of reform in Ottawa. And to me, Alberta could just be a wonderful, wonderful independent country. I would love to see it happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Ferg, thanks for coming on.
Thank you, mate. I appreciate the opportunity. Cheers.
That was Fergus Hodgson. You can check him out on Twitter at Ferg Hodgson. You can find his book, The Latin American Red Pill, on Amazon. Thanks for listening. See you later.